Collaborative professional learning is becoming an integral part to education and lifelong learning, particularly as we are still under the impact of COVID and the challenges that come with that. We still do not know the real long-term impact on learning and our future. And one of the goals of sustainable development set by the UN in 2015 is to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and to promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. It's paramount to collaborate and learn from each other to contribute to our communities and the wider educational world. I'm a firm believer that teacher educators need to start from ourselves and to share and learn from each other's experience and use evidence and research critically to inform our thinking and decision making. So today in the Adult Learning Hub, I am so excited to be in conversation with Joyce Chen. We're seeking to promote the work of those who are in the sector of adult ed, and I can't wait for our discussion today. So to briefly introduce you to Joyce, Joyce has been working in different educational sectors for more than 20 years, from primary education to higher ed, and her subject specialism is teaching English to speakers of other languages and supporting learners with English and math skills. Her current job role includes initial teacher education, organizational development, and teachers' professional development and learning in a general further education college in England. She is also a chartered teacher who received the advanced teacher status in the first cohort in 2018. And she has undertaken several practitioner action research projects over the last 10 years in the further education sector. Her main research interests are policies and practices focused on professional development and learning, collaborative professional learning, and practitioner-led participatory action research and narrative inquiry-based research methods. And she's currently a PhD candidate at the University of Sunderland in the UK. Wow, a decorative scholar and academic. I'm so excited to be speaking with Joyce today. Welcome.
Hi, Jane. It's nice to be invited and in this space today. And yeah, it was probably the whole CV in front of everybody there.
You have such an array of accomplishments, and I think it's so wonderful that the Adult Learning Hub can speak with individuals like you who are not only academics, but who are also really passionate about what they do. And I can't wait to dive into our discussion today. So I always think, and I always start off with a story in the Adult Learning Hub. And so I would really love to know where you got your start with teaching adult learners. What was that initial spark that got you interested in the field?
Oh, I love this question. It's a question I always ask people who come into teaching, actually. Interestingly, as you heard my background, my initial background wasn't teaching adults, it was actually teaching children. And really the first time I started teaching adult properly was actually in 2004. So about 20 years ago now. So I completed my master's degree in teaching English to speakers of other languages. And I thought, I was young and I was only 25 and I was in London. I thought, I have the opportunity, maybe I can do some teaching here. So when I was looking for jobs, I didn't really think about teaching adults in the first place. But then I realized that there was a huge demand for teaching adults, particularly adults who are from different countries. And there was quite a number of adults who are from sort of immigration backgrounds or refugees. So I got a job in a community college in London. So I started teaching mainly immigrants and refugees English as their second language. So that was quite a new experience to me because I didn't know how to teach adults, although I had all the theories in my mind, how to teach children. And some of the principles apply. But I always remember the most memorable experience was I was teaching this lady. She was a mother and she was from Romania she didn't have any literacy skills, even in her first language. So she came to the community college, and obviously because she couldn't speak English, she couldn't write. So I ended up sort of thinking, oh dear, how do I help her? I spoke to her, trying to use my sign language and different kind of symbols, talking to her. And she tried to tell me her story, and to be honest, it was really emotional because she came here as a refugee, didn't know anyone, had young children, couldn't speak the language, couldn't write. So you can imagine that in those days, particularly at that time, she had to complete a lot of documents, for her school's children, for herself. So I remember, I had to relearn actually about how to teach an adult like her. So I still remember starting from learning how to hold a pen. So I was helping her holding a pen. And guess what? After a whole year, I remember the whole year, just kind of encouraging her, holding her hand, literally showing her she could write her name. And I still remember that moment. She could write her name by herself, holding a pen, and her face, her smile, it was still in my mind now. And I still talk about this story till now, when I, talk to my teacher trainees and so on, saying that was an amazing moment. I thought I think that lady, this student, was empowered by being able to write her name.
Amazing.
But, yeah, that story just kind of stayed with me. And I thought, what education, why is it important? This story tells me why it's important. So, yeah. So it really kind of brought me back a lot of memories, and I was new as well. I was new in a new country as well. So I could associate so much with how she was feeling, and how she felt, how she was thinking. There was nobody to help her out. And I remember spending lots of extra time with her, just kind of helping her, holding a pen.
Yeah.
So.
And it's amazing, isn't it, to go on that journey with adult learners and to be a part of that. And as you said, empowering her. And it can be something as simple, what we perceive as being simple, as holding a pen or writing her name. And that's something I think probably that has stayed with her. And it's obviously stayed with you as well.
Yes. yeah. That was that starting moment, her smile and her thank you to say I could write my name. I could sign my name, I could write my name. You can't beat that kind of powerful narrative of her story, and I just kind of feel really glad to be in that journey with her. And sometimes I think I wonder where she is now. I wonder what she's doing now.
Right.
I only taught her for a year, and then I still moved on, really. So that was that was amazing.
Brilliant. And I think all adult educators, they have a story that kind of sparks what got them into the field and what still excites them about working with adult learners, even to this day. So I also like to ask at the beginning of my conversations with people, what's one unknown fact that most people do not know about Joyce?
Oh gosh. It's a tricky one, actually. I mean, I guess if I just talk about my personal experience, not just work, because I think that the story which I just mentioned was kind of really stay with me. But my personal experience, I think probably I'll mention I climb up to Mount Kinabalu in Borneo. And
wow.
if you don't know about, obviously the audience don't know about Mount Kinabalu, it's kind of the highest mountain in Borneo.
Amazing.
I think it might be East Asia. So that was quite an experience. I don't claim myself as a mountain climber at all, but that was tough. That was tough. And I want to go back to Borneo again if I can. That was amazing experience.
Incredible. Wow. How many years ago did you do that? How long ago was that?
I think must be, I would say at least 10 years ago.
Wow.
9-10 years ago, and obviously I miss it, particularly because of COVID. You see,
Yeah.
travel very far. So yeah, that was amazing. Yes.
Hopefully we can have those kinds of experiences again soon.
I hope so.
Well, one of the reasons, Joyce, why I was really interested to talk to you today is around your experience with collaborative learning. And we often hear about this term, sort of joint practice development, floating around in the adult ed sector. But I wonder about how many educators actually know about what it is. So I'm curious, we'll just dive right in. Can you explain what joint practice development is and how exactly it's conducted?
Yeah, of course.
Hmm.
My whole study is based around joint practice development.
Yes, yes. I love talking to people about what they're most skilled at and most passionate about. These are the greatest conversations.
Well, I'm gonna start off. This
Mm,
may not be something what people want to hear, but joint practice development is actually nothing new. It's not a
mm,
new idea,
mm,
right? And I'm not gonna dwell on sort of the linguistic terminology of it, because again, once you go into that, there will be a huge debate. But
mm,
what I want to say is the whole idea of joint practice development, really its emphasis is on the kind of egalitarian, the practitioner-centered approach, and it's from building relationships. So we talk about building relationships to learning, to
mm,
supporting each other, to challenging each other, and then we collaboratively reflecting and evaluating together.
mhm,
So this is not something I would say a one-off event. It's definitely not a one-off event.
mm,
But I also want to emphasize that obviously in terms of the history of joint practice development or this term, I think originally it was from Fielding et al. So there's a group of researchers from University of Sussex and Demos in the UK. So again,
mhm,
this is very UK context.
mm,
And they wrote, basically they collaboratively completed research, and the work they published is called Factors Influencing the Transfer of Good Practice, mainly in the school sector. Okay, so they are looking into, what factors actually help transferring of good practice.
mm,
So obviously, this concept at that time was really new, and the terminology of it, the JPD or joint practice development, came from this piece of work. And then it kind of was followed through by other researchers as well. So for example, Hargreaves from University of Cambridge, again, conducted another study in 2011-12, talking about JPD is really important to professional development, particularly in creating and sustaining a self-improving inter-school system. So again, it's related to professional development and professional learning. So obviously, I don't want to dwell too much into the literature, but if people are interested in reading about, what is happening, what happened, we think the sort of joint practice development, I think these two pieces of work are essential. But going back to your question, I'm sure if you say, for example, I've done that before, I Google it. Okay, so let's Google joint practice development and see what comes up. And you can see, this term probably is mentioned, on different platforms. Platforms, for example, probably about educational consultancy, or it's a concept, and it probably came up with government literature as well. But what I want to emphasize on is, particularly coming from my own experience and study, it is not a magic solution. I keep telling people, although I use joint practice development, it's not a magic solution to solve staff development issues or professional development issues. For me, fundamentally, it is going back to the culture, so what kind of culture are we in, as an organization, and what kind of culture do we envisage, our organization want to be. So I think joint practice development to me is more like a philosophical foundation of what we need to see in professional development learning. But I think maybe when we break it down a bit further, I can give you some examples of it. But I suppose in a nutshell, for me, it's about, not just about creating a community, because creating community takes a lot of efforts. And I'm sure you know as well, Jane, it takes lots of efforts, and it's not a short-term solution or panacea, and I think very often in education, we tend to see a lot of those kind of ideas coming out, so magic solutions or a one-off kind of toolkit, so I think those kind of language or discourse is something I'm trying to avoid, and I don't want to associate joint practice development to this kind of discourse. So basically, I think probably some people are aware of it, but I think I wonder how many people really delve into the depth of joint practice development. And then what is it like in practice, really? So I hope that I answered the first question of
Absolutely. And, in the Adult Learning Hub as well, obviously, we're kind of a form of, community and collaborative learning, being an extension of kind of joint practice development. But I do like the emphasis on building relationships, in order to sustain our practice, and giving people a reason to collaborate together in order to develop our practice further. So you alluded to earlier, it's not a one-off training session. It's not perhaps a be-all and end-all solution for professional development. But I think it is an exciting alternative that people can see. They can see their practice perhaps through a different lens. And I'm curious to know kind of what are the benefits of JPD or joint practice development as opposed to one-off training sessions or professional development courses or sort of regular CPD?
Well, I want to start from my own experience, really, because I've been a teacher for 20 years, and I don't know how many kind of, we call them CPD sessions, continuous professional development session I've been to. So whether it's listening to experts, talking about some ideas, or through other platforms, either online courses or even like informal kind of learning from colleagues. But I often say, how often, these kind of ideas are actually translated into our practice, and how often do we actually, use them, or even like share more widely across, within the community we are working with. So that was very much my first question. And again, when I started looking at joint practice development, and that was an experience I had over 10 years ago. And that was when I heard about joint practice development. Because again, I was quite skeptical about it. I thought, oh, here we go. There's somebody else came out with a new idea, about working together. And I was quite skeptical about it. But then at that time, I was involved in an action research project myself, so very small scale, and I just wanted to explore something, with my students about formative assessment, how formative assessment looks like. So I thought, I would like to do an action research project about that. And then because of the project I was involved with, so I attended, a series of residentials with a team of teachers from University of Sunderland, and they gave us Fielding et al.'s article about joint practice development. So I read about it, and I realized what they were trying to say was actually, by using joint practice development, we really dwell into the fundamental conditions we are in, and the context we are in. So I realized that actually, by using joint practice development as the guiding principles, and now I will talk about the principles in a minute, is that we are engaging with other people by having share the same motivation, the same passion, the same interest, but for the benefit of, say, for example, our students, our learners, or even the communities we are in. So for me, the benefit of it is not from the hierarchy, so how often, when you attend those CPD events and so on, probably they are very much prescribed by, for example, your managers, or from top down in the hierarchies, or maybe there are certain agenda, quite often in education, we know the kind of, for example, Ofsted, the kind of external agencies where
exactly
you
have to do it, you must do it, you need to attend in order to keep your job or to perform at a certain standard or level.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I kind of, looking back, I didn't realize. I thought, yeah, I've been to this CPD event, I've been to that event, and then I started questioning myself, what was the purpose of attending those sessions? And then how actually helpful, those sessions I've been to benefit, benefit my own practice, and then benefit my students. So when we go back to JPD, I think the key benefits of it is not, we're not doing it for hierarchy. We're not doing it because we've been told to do so. Instead, as I said, the practitioner led. So it's very much from the ground. And I know there's been a lot of talk about, grassroots, so we use the word grassroots CPD and so on. But again, I don't like that discourse either. What I like is actually we're just a group of people who are passionate about developing an aspect of our practice. And we get together, and based on, very importantly, based on trust, based on our relationships, because otherwise you can't have an open conversation about it if you don't trust each other. So it's very important to go back. I call them basically the first stage, really, and if we look at some of the literature, particularly from Maggie Gregson et al., in 2015, they actually wrote a guide about joint practice development. And again, I want to emphasize it's a guide, but you need to be using caution in different contexts. But those principles, I think they are very helpful throughout my teaching career in the last 10 years, after I heard about it. So I think, again, in a nutshell, the first step is about creating that conditions for collaborative relationship and improvement of practice. And then the step 2 is about sharing experience or practice. So again, the word sharing is in an equal measure. So it's not actually by an expert, So again, going back to the CPD situation, you tend to get the expert coming to tell you this is a good idea. It doesn't actually do anything about it, or it's not actually used in your context. But I think very important to share that experience of practice. And then it's very important that we need the space, we need the space, we need the time, to really talk about our experience and exploring. The next step will be the ideas. The step 3 is about, okay, so what ideas do we have? Whether or not, maybe those ideas been working or maybe not working, but as a group, we will identify those kind of priorities, for ideas. And then we will try them out. Okay, so those are ideas. Maybe we create resources, maybe we create activities, or maybe we sort of coming out of learning more, for a bit of research maybe. So again, it doesn't have to be something somebody else have created, but what we do is through kind of researching ideas and creating resources, and then we put them into practice. That's used. And then the end of the sort of, we call it the cycle, is then we get together, we talk about how it's going, and we reflect on it, and then we evaluate. So that kind of cycle keep going round and round. But I must say, this cycle, again, is nothing new. If you think about many other professional development ideas, they tend to be in kind of cyclical,
Mm, mm,
models. So for me, the key is about that kind of opportunities and equality in taking part. So I think this is what I call the philosophy of it. So rather than this kind of hierarchy sometimes we experience in organizations or perhaps in the communities even, that kind of power relations in joint practice development. We need to flatten this kind of hierarchy, because we have to treat each other equal. So I think going back to your opening introduction, that kind of made me think about sustainability. How can we provide sustainability in development, in professional development, in teachers' professional development? But we need to search for a suitable way to work together, rather than very much all the time we feel like some teachers say firefighting. We're firefighting. What the hierarchy wants, but not actually what our students want or what the teachers want.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting is over the last probably year and a half, I think there's been a number of educators who probably have engaged in joint practice development, maybe informally, without perhaps even being aware of it. But I think what's nice about talking about joint practice development is that it names it and it gives a framework around which our practice can be brought forward even further when we understand how it works and what kind of voice people are able to bring to the table. And as you said, it's non-hierarchical and it's led by practitioners. And I think when we know how to do it, and the kind of trust and relationship, the context that it takes place in, can be really, really powerful for, developing ourselves as educators, ultimately to serve our learners better, which is really exciting. And I think some of the things that you alluded to around having space and time to engage in these types of activities with each other, I think can only help us, feel even more motivated to, embody the values that we want to portray to our learners. Now, I'm curious about sort of where your interest started in joint practice development and a bit about the research that you're engaged in currently. I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, 10 years ago, I got involved in an action research project. So that was really the very first time I heard about this term, really, joint practice development. But like what you said, I recognize some of the similarities that I have been engaging with, my colleagues, really. So as I said, that's why I say JPD is nothing new. But sometimes you kind of realize, actually, this is how we teachers, professionals, how we have been working.
Yeah.
But somehow, this aspect of learning is not often heard, because again, we know that, when teachers are learning, we learn through having dialogues, we learn through sharing, we learn through sharing frustration about what's going on and what works and what doesn't work. But very often, this kind of voice, I guess, in current kind of climate, because it's not evidenced, and it doesn't really show in a graph, a chart, or numbers. So sometimes it's not kind of considered to be impactful. So for me, that is my frustration, and obviously going back to, why I started my doctorate study, and my doctorate study is focusing on joint practice development. So, going back to my experience, when I first heard about joint practice development, I kind of describing this experience as planting a seed. So again, as you know, in education, I think a lot of people like to describe it like growing a tree, and for me, that kind of idea or concept of growing a tree is still really valid, because we need to nurture it. So for me, 10 years ago, that seed was planted, in my mind. And because I was still teaching English as a second language to adults and young adults as well. And I collaborated with my colleagues, the students as well, because a lot of my work is in the community. So I realized, that this concept and guiding kind of framework of joint practice development has been with me all these years, for 10 years. And only until about 5 years ago, I changed my job. So I became sort of a teacher educator. So, the opportunity arrived. And also I'm involved in a lot of organizational and professional development side of things and the quality side of things. So I realized the timing was right, okay? Because sometimes we also have to bear in mind, going back to the right conditions, I mean, the right conditions mean something to different people. So for me, 5 years ago, that was the right condition. And I thought, well, I want to study this. I know I've been using it, but I want to really document. I want to record. I want to know, what does it actually look like when I try to, put JPD into practice. So again, my thesis is very much based on practitioner action research model, and it really coincides with JPD cycle as well. So they are very much kind of compatible, in many ways. But I also want to capture, I really want to capture and reveal, the whole experiences of the participants I'm engaging with and myself. So I want to know, what is it like for the colleagues who experience, joint practice development, and what is it like for me, who position as I suppose, a person who facilitate JPD, because I introduced this idea, and I need to facilitate it, plus being a researcher, so this kind of multiple identities of, being involved in a research, a quite substantial piece of research, plus using joint practice development. So these are all kind of intertwined in a way, and I want to record it. I want to tell their stories. And I want to tell their stories. I also want to see what my stories intertwine with their stories and what comes out. Okay. So my concept very much, their stories, because they all individually have their own story, their own narrative, my story, and then, what comes out of it. So it's very much a journey, of, what I always wanted to do. And it's always at the center of my heart when I'm working with either students or colleagues. So yeah, so I realized, and also I realized I need to be quite disciplined. I know some people may not choose doing a doctorate as a route, because you can use many other different opportunities to document this kind of experience. But for me, the other side of it is also by using research and literature, to find out, what does the literature say and what does it say in my practice, and to see what comes out. So yeah, so again, in short, that was quite a long journey actually, thinking about it.
I think that's one of the most exciting things I know from my own experience doing my grad work in adult ed and reading something in literature, and then also looking at my own experience and thinking, how does this match up? To what extent does the literature inform what I'm doing, and vice versa? And when you can see your practice through another lens, it's always so exciting. Which I think is, what you're alluding to is, looking at, okay, what's the framework that I can put around what's already happening, what I'm already engaging in, looking at my stories, the stories of my students. But when we look at it through the lens of joint practice development and through literature, it's so exciting and really invigorating. I can only imagine what it must be like to, look at this even further in your research. So what have you learned as an educator that you've been able to apply to your practice through conducting this really exciting research? I'd love to know what you've been able to apply or think about even on a deeper level.
Wow, it's a lot. I mean,
Mm,
I always find teaching is the best career because you're always learning. But
mm,
I think through doing my study, and through obviously all these years of learning, as an adult educator and so on,
mm,
there are so many different aspects of, I would say, skills, experience that I have gained. And I'm still continuing, learning about it. Again, I often use the word situated. A lot of learning is
mm,
situated because
mm.
we are dealing with everyday problems. We are dealing with people. And I often tell a lot of people that teaching, you are with people all the time, with humans.
Right, you can't escape.
Yeah, exactly. So you got to remember that, even say, for example, last year when I was teaching online, okay, we are teaching through a platform or maybe a virtual learning environment. But at the end of the day, the people we are interacting with.
Mm,
So coming back to being an educator, what I find I'm still learning today
mm,
is about people. It's about trying to listen to the experience, trying to see, where they are, trying to see, the impact from their past experience to now.
mm,
And I guess a huge part of it, I know it sounds probably overused, but the word being reflective and being reflexive, I think it's a very important part of my practice. And it's ongoing. You can't just say I've done reflection. And I think quite often, particularly in teacher education, I think doing your reflection is very important. But
mm,
doing reflection, I think technically speaking, for a lot of people, they think, oh yeah, I've done my reflection, I wrote down something. But for me, it's not just about writing it down. It is almost like every step of your action, your thinking, your action is part of that practice.
mm, mm,
So I would say, being reflexive and being reflective is a huge part of it. But obviously, there are other skills coming to it. For example, I know this may be very kind of practical, like project management, skills management, time management, critical thinking, and obviously doing research. I really need to be able to read, and write
mm, mm,
at that level. So I think some people call it research literacy,
mm,
so I found, this is something I probably wasn't very good at when I started my journey, but I'm still on that journey, so you have to keep going. It's a bit
mm,
like practice, really. You have to
mm,
keep doing it and keep kind of making adjustment and thinking how you went.
mm,
And finally, I think, going back to what I mentioned before, because we are working with people, um, people are at the heart of what we do every day.
mm,
So I think I want to highlight, an ethic of care. Going back to what I mentioned about being caring
mm,
is so important, because I find that, if you care about the person, you put your efforts in, you put your heart in. But when you don't care, you will find that, naturally people around you or the students you teach, they also become like that.
mm,
Because if you don't care about it, why should they care?
mm. We indirectly model those kind of values, whether we're aware of it or not.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I like the word you say, modeling. Actually,
Mm,
that was all along what I'm thinking. We model, because when we say modeling, it's not just about the actual doing. For example, how do you do this? How do you complete piece of work, or how do you build, a
mm,
car and so on, or fix a car? It is about also the human factors, our
mm,
emotional side of things.
mm,
We also need to model it. And particularly in an age of uncertainties, we are still talking about COVID,
mm,
globally. So, if we don't show our care, I'm really concerned, what will come out of it, because uh, without care, how do we carry on?
mm. And it certainly comes across in our practice, doesn't it? When we do care, we do demonstrate that sort of duty of care towards our learners, in terms of the outcomes they experience, how they progress in our classes. And teachers, we need to be conscious of our practice and how we come across. I think that's quite interesting, some of the points that you mentioned around that. And also our concern as well, too, if we don't care, we run into the risk of having adult learners probably who are going to become complacent in the near future. You might want to give up with learning because everything also is happening online now. A lot of, education sort of activities, continuous learning is happening online. You think about what kind of learners we're breeding as a result of their interactions with us. So I think it's an even further call for joint practice development or collaborative learning with our peers. So what changes have you noticed that COVID has brought about for us in the field of adult ed? And why do you think it's even more vital now that we start from ourselves rather than from our learners first when it comes to developing our practice, the very core of what we're about? Why should we start with ourselves as educators?
Well, I think that kind of links nicely, when we just talk about
Mm,
modeling, talking about
mm,
the ethic of care.
mm,
And I think a lot of words coming up from during COVID is well-being,
mm.
and I think the word well-being, ironically, we shouldn't talk about it because it should be every day. We should all have well-being every day rather than it's highlighted as a problem.
Interesting. I
You
tend
know,
to agree.
yeah, when you talk about
Mm,
well-being, it means there must be a problem about it. So we have to highlight it.
mm,
So obviously it is a problem, it is an
mm,
issue. And certainly, from my own experience, I went through ups and downs last year.
mm,
And yes, my well-being seemed to suffer because I care for other people, but I forgot to care for myself.
mm,
Because you often think about, okay, my students and how they are, how they are getting on their work and are they going to complete it, but we forget about our own well-being. So when
mm,
I talk about our own well-being, I think the word self-care
mm,
always comes up. But when I mention about self-care, it's not being selfish, okay? And it's also not being ignoring everybody else's needs,
that's right. Mm,
because I think the word is, I think, interdependent, because we are living in a society, we are so close yet so far, so in terms of starting from ourselves, I
mm,
often, when I support new teachers, because a huge part of my job is supporting new teachers
mm,
to the college,
mm,
and I often say, it's very important, you got to look after yourself as well, because without looking after yourself first, how can you look after your students? And again, that goes back to modeling it, and we are not very good at it, particularly in teaching or in any kind of sector where we are closely with people. And I
mm,
think certainly like social work, and we know nursing, care home, all these different jobs, actually we forget fundamentally it's so important that we need to start for ourselves. We need to find a way to balance our own well-being and
absolutely.
work.
It's like that quote. I've heard a quote recently about, setting yourself on fire to keep other people warm. And I think educators are very guilty of that in a way, taking care of others first before ourselves. And as you said, it's not selfish, but it's more so that we can give out to our students, so that we can give out to our family and friends, but getting back to what you said, sorry, around well-being.
Yeah. And I
Mm,
think as well, when
mm,
when when we always experiencing burnt out, the word is
mm,
burnt out, when we keep constantly feeling burnt out,
mm,
our career will be shortened. I think it sounds quite scary, but if you put it in perspective, and particularly in the educational world, and we talk about sustainability here. So how do we make education or educational work sustainable? So important. And going back to starting from ourselves, how can we make sure that we are looking after each other, looking after ourselves, and by doing so, we can then making it long term, making it sustainable. And I think it's a huge topic, it's a huge, issue here. And I think, again, I often ask a lot of teachers, particularly experienced teachers, looking back, why did we come into teaching in the first place? And how our values and our beliefs, our ethics, keep us going. But how long can it keep us going? And I certainly, for me, 20 years, yeah, it's long, but to many people, it's not actually that long yet. So, I'm often thinking, how do I sustain my passion, my care for my students, my colleagues, for the next 10 years and 20 years. So this is the real issue here. And I think very often those things don't go into any policies, or policy makers' minds about it. And although there is, in a positive note, because of COVID, there's more talks about, well-being, and more talks about, students. But I think it's still not enough in terms of talking about educators, talking about teachers.
To take it kind of one step further, to really look at, okay, the context in which our professional development is happening. And educators seem to thrive when that's in, the context of relationships, being able to sustain those relationships long term. And as you said, like, not just for our selfish, for us to be selfish, but it's more about, long-term sustaining our careers, and also looking at how we can improve outcomes for learners at the same time. But I think definitely educators, we set ourselves on fire, in order to keep other people warm. And I think that's something that we need to look at and be able to quantify, because as you said, sometimes that can be a little bit hard to, prove to stakeholders, when getting funding. And that's always the tricky part, I think, of is applying these sort of metrics to learning, to professional development. So that kind of leads on to my next point, actually, around opposition to this idea of joint practice development. Like, what would you say to practitioners or institutions who are perhaps not willing to engage in this practice because some of the reasons that we mentioned? What might you say to combat some of the perhaps negativity around it?
Why not?
I think what have you got to lose?
Yeah, well, I think yeah, exactly. I think if in all fairness, if it helps the teachers at different level, and lots of different levels, why not? And I think it's a tricky one. Again, as I said at the very beginning of our discussion, JPD is not a panacea. It's not a magic solution. It's not a magic toolkit or anything I'm trying to put in a package to sell to you. But I think for me, it's about, again, listening to different perspectives. So my actually not to say something, but I will probably ask the question, why not? And let me listen to what you say. Let me listen, what your thinking is, and tell me, why what your thinking is in terms of JPD. I think it's quite an important part, I find, in education as well. It's about the whole idea about education is being able to listen and having a gut conversation. And yes, we can challenge each other, perhaps, maybe they have done it, maybe it didn't work. Okay, that's fair enough, because we know that, again, there's no magic solution. Everything's got its two sides of things, so yeah, why not?
Right. In that kind of spirit of experimentation and research, it's like, treat it as learning. Why not go for it and see what happens?
Yeah.
So along these lines of continuing our professional development? Obviously, COVID has kind of put a spanner in the works in terms of how we approach our own professional development, the further training that we engage in. So what are your predictions for professional development in the future? Will we see more joint practice development? What are your ideas around sort of training for adult educators in the future?
Well, it's quite a big question, and
Mm,
it's a question that I have been thinking, actually
mm,
throughout COVID as well, because
mm.
um, uh, as we are aware, the whole COVID situation really almost like speed up, how we move on to using technologies, as you know, the adult learning hub, is another example of amazing kind of innovation,
Mm.
how we use technologies to carry on our learning,
Yeah,
learning
and to come
process.
together.
Yeah.
Mm,
So I think these will not go away, and I hope it won't go away,
mm,
because it also provides flexibility as well, particularly for adult learners. I think very often in the past, I'm also an advocate for using technology and so on. But for me, it's also important, again, in the context,
mm,
also, the suitability of it. And I think it's amazing how quickly, because of COVID, suddenly we all went into lockdown. We all had to use Zoom, Teams, or whatever platform we are using. So we all kind of suddenly, we all had to embrace it, obviously unwillingly.
whether we liked it or not. For some educators, there was a huge, backlash. I can't do it. I don't want to do it. But then
Yeah,
some who really embraced it, who really
yeah,
went for it because they were propelled into this new, atmosphere for teaching, new environment for teaching.
definitely. But also have to think about the benefits for our adult learners. I mean,
Mm,
we
mm,
know adult learners, there are barriers, to adult learners, whether, for example, like in my case, is trying to work, trying to study. It's hard. It's hard to juggle. But suddenly, all the courses or meetings or even like tutorials can be done online. Suddenly, we are more flexible. We can actually provide different kind of choice, for
mm,
our adult learners and to
mm,
ourselves.
mm,
So I think I have thought about this actually, and I can't really describe it, in a short sentence, but I did come up with 5 concepts. I call them 5 C's. Okay.
mm,
So
mm,
obviously the first one is definitely communities.
mm,
I mean, we can't sustain, we can't work in silo. We need communities. But equally, communities, it can be an empty shell. We can call everything a community. So what we need is also collaboration. We
mm,
need to be able to, we need to talk to each other. We need to know each other. Again, going back to, as I mentioned about the joint practice development, that first stage of creating conditions, you can't just roll something out, without understanding each other and each other's context. And
mm,
then the third C I mentioned is choice. We have choice. So whether it's digital, whether it's face to face, or whether it's blended learning, all these different, again, all these different words coming out from COVID, it also gives us more autonomy because,
mm,
adult learners actually thinking about it, you can take charge, you can take responsibility, you can actually choose, what suits you. But on the flip side is, obviously organizations, educational organizations really need to think about this hard. Do we have the capacity to offer,
mm.
all these different kind of choice? And I think that is obviously back in my mind as well. Am I able to accommodate everyone's needs?
Right.
Is
Is it
that
scalable for organizations? I think that's a question we're going to be asking ourselves for the next few years.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Yeah. And then the fourth C is creative,
Mm,
innovation. Because, again, it's important that we human beings, why are we here? We
mm,
are innovative. That's why we are here now. We are still
mm,
here now. And then, through creativity, I think the final C I was thinking about is cross-disciplinary. I think I'm probably trying to be clever here, because I'm thinking, oh, what will be another C I can use? And I think, I suppose
that seems appropriate.
Interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary is so important, because in the old days when I was a student, everything was in a box. Okay, so this is geography, this is art, this is English. But now I'm thinking, through my own experience of being a teacher and being a student myself, being a parent, I'm thinking, why do we still putting everything in a box? Why do we still doing that? But actually nowadays, particularly being an adult learner myself, I realize, I don't put all this in a box anymore. That we can all learn from each other. So that goes back to the collaboration, and that's why it's important. We can't just have a single community for one thing. It's very important to invite, to have, very healthy, different kind of discipline, different kind of people from various sectors to come together, to work together. So I think these 5 C's, hopefully, I don't know, I'm still kind of playing with this idea, and I'm still trying to explore. And I want to ask, actually, maybe a good question to ask our here. I think that'd be very exciting, to know what the future is in terms of professional development and learning, really.
And we've already seen some of these elements of professional development happening already. Adult educators from across contexts, across borders, coming together and sharing resources in ways they never have before. Because I don't want to say we've been forced to, but it's been a massive exercise in us building relationships and relying on those relationships, to better our practice, to feel more comfortable working online. But I think it's also highlighted at the same time too, our lack of digital skills for some, and that's being a further area perhaps that we can develop more in the future. But I like what you said, those sort of 5 C's. So just to reiterate those again, you mentioned communities, collaboration, choice, creativity, and cross-disciplinary. Did I get that right?
That's right. Yeah. Well done.
Did I get a gold star? Just kidding, I'm just kidding. Fascinating. So the last question I have for you, Joyce, and this is what I ask a lot of people who I speak to, is what are the 3 things that you know to be true about learning in adulthood? As we wrap up our conversation today, what are 3 things that you know to be true?
Wow, it's a very deep question.
I feel like Oprah whenever I ask that question.
It's amazing. I mean, it's because, I don't want to go into philosophical debate about what is true.
3 simple truths that you
I think obviously I teach adult learners, so I think the word andragogy, andragogy keeps coming up. And I think what I often say is, a lot of assumptions I made when I was younger, like, oh, like you hear people say, oh, I'm too old to learn something. And I don't believe in it. In fact, we all have wealth of experiences and knowledge. And I think experiences is really important about learning in adulthood. We refer back to our previous experiences, but don't forget, I think I have to tell myself, don't forget, we are also creating experience now. So not just dwelling on the past experience, but it's also important to create new experiences. And don't stop.
That's right.
Creating new experiences.
That's right. And learning from those experiences, being able to sit with ourselves and say, okay, what have I taken away from this? What can I apply to my future self?
Exactly. And I think that keeps everybody going. And that's why I come to realization, and the reason why I'm doing more study now and than ever, actually, interestingly, I think I found my passion of learning when I'm older. When I was younger, because coming from a different culture, it was not enjoyable, because you're all about exams. It was all about tests. It's all about getting to that league table, the top
Mm,
levels.
mm,
So I suppose I didn't really enjoy learning as such. And now, being an adult learner myself, I think I have sort of found my joy of learning again, although it's not always easy, because learning can
mm,
be quite deliberate, quite hard. Certainly
mm.
my doctorate study has not been easy and
Right.
hard.
And learning is incidental as well. We don't set out to learn something, but we do as a result of experience, which you sort of led us to earlier. Yeah.
Definitely. And I think as an adult learner as well, I think motivation is very important. I
Mm,
think a lot of people talk about intrinsic, like your internal motivation, like I want to do it. It is really important, because without I want to do it, you won't start.
mm,
So I think
mm,
it is important, and I believe it's true. And I
mm,
think certainly sometimes when I have conversations and just observing, my own students, um, to be honest, when they're in my class, it's always amazing, how it's their first step, for
mm,
any of them. And
mm,
going back to the story I told you at the beginning,
mm,
by she actually was in my class, she took that first very brave step to come and admit it, that she couldn't write her name, she couldn't
mm,
read, she couldn't speak the language, and so on. It was brave, and I think being
mm,
an adult
mm,
learner as well, it's about not worry about failure, and that links to
mm,
the experience we all sometimes have. And then by thinking about it in a different light, actually maybe this will help, so that goes into the motivation, and I want to do it. And then I think the third truth I would say, is adult learners want to solve problems. We talk about everyday problems,
yes.
and that's why we learn, because I want to know how to solve this problem, I want to know how to
Mm,
solve that problem. So I
mm,
think this problem solving, for us, is important in
mm,
practice, in our
mm,
everyday practice. So yeah, I think again, it's hard to say what is true, but I think from my observation and my own experience, I think experience, motivation, and solving problems are
mm,
probably I think is really important and true about adult learning.
mm. I
Yeah.
think for educators, being tasked with the learning of adults, regardless of the context, it's our role to help them be even more self-directed and orientated towards solving problems and empowering learners. And I think, as you alluded to in our conversation, it is about coming together as educators and collaborating on a more rigorous scale, in that we are regularly talking to each other about what's happening in our practice and how we can further improve outcomes for our learners. But Joyce, it was such a pleasure talking to you today, and I loved some of what you mentioned, and speaking about your research and further improving collaboration for educators and adults across borders and contexts and disciplines. So I just wanted to thank you so much for joining me today. We could keep going. Maybe we'll keep going again in the future. Really enjoyed it. And if people want to get in touch with you further, Joyce, what's the best way to do that if they want to talk to you more about joint practice development or collaboration, other than being in the Adult Learning Hub? How can people get in touch with you?
Oh well, yeah, I was gonna say number one, the adult learning hub. Obviously people who are already in the community can
Mm,
text me.
mm,
Or obviously I'm on Twitter as well. So
mm.
it's at Joyce Chen 1. I think probably I'll ask you actually to put it somewhere so people can
Yeah,
use
I'll
it.
put it in the comments section below so people will have that.
Yeah. Or LinkedIn, I think LinkedIn as well. I got a profile. So if you
Mm.
search for Joyce Chen, it will be there. Yeah.
Excellent. Cool. Well, if anyone also is interested in membership with the Adult Learning Hub, they can go to the adultlearninghub.com. If you're an adult educator, practitioner, or adult learning professional, this is the place for you. You can find people like Joyce and myself there, as well as other amazing practitioners who are growing their practice. But I wanted to thank you, Joyce, again for our discussion today, and looking forward to connecting with you again soon. Thanks
Yeah.
again.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you for having me.
All right, take care. Bye.
Bye.